Okay, let's talk about liberty for a little bit. So the word liberty comes from Latin liber, which means free. You can look this up in any dictionary of etymology. And obviously, the word free comes with, many connotations, right? We'll get to that in a minute. But generally, there are two senses in which this is used traditionally. There's the sense of liberty, which generally we are talking about political freedom, right? But then the other way, and we don't tend to use this much anymore, but there's also liberal in terms of giving. And so we could say, someone is very liberal with their spending. That would mean that, they're not cheap, basically, right? Both of them have to do, you can see how, to spend freely or to live freely. You see the connection, right? It has to do with freedom. But then there's also another one called libertine, and we don't use this one very much anymore. And libertine means a person who is given to license. All these words, eh? So here's the deal. A libertine is given to license, and license is extreme freedom, so much that it literally means permission, to give permission. And the idea is that when one has license, especially when they give themselves license, so you can understand driver's license would be, the quintessential example, right? So you don't have a right to drive. You're given permission to drive by the, state or county government, whoever does them. And then, so when we talk about a libertine, this is a person who gives themselves license to do whatever they want. So traditionally, and this was big in the 18th century, the concept of a libertine was somebody who had no self-control. So the libertine or libertine, depending how you talk about it, was a party person, basically. What we might call, perhaps like a Paris Hilton kind of person. Don Giovanni in the opera by Mozart is a great example. Don Giovanni. Okay, so this is what liberty means. It has to do with freedom. Now, going back, I just want to make the point here. You might think, oh, today, modern liberals, how we understand the word liberal today might mean, okay, well, Democrats, if they're liberal, they tend to give away things in social programs. Not at all. It's not at all what the word liberal politically means. In fact, we're not really going to use this definition of the term at all. And for us, in the ensuing discussion, we're sticking to this one. Okay, so now let's look at a couple things. So if we're talking about freedom as liberty, right? So here we have liberty and freedom, right? Now let's talk about what this means. All these things, you have to think of them on a scale. So on one level, you have oppression, right? And on the other scale, you have complete freedom. Okay. So this would look like here, if we're talking political, this would be like, dictatorship or authoritarianism. There's actually a couple of different words we could use. Let's call it a dictatorship. So under a dictatorship, we have oppression, and there is no or very little freedom, right? Whereas here, complete freedom means there's no laws, no compulsion. In other words, that's anarchy. And then there's gradations all the way along, right? So let's say someone in the middle, right? So what we call a moderate would want, well, some freedom, because you don't want to be, living in a dictatorship, but anarchy is just as bad, right? So a moderate would be somebody that wants to balance off anarchy and dictatorship, right? But then there's nuances along the way. So if you're maybe conservative, whatever, there's many ways you could put yourself here. But then the next thing becomes, okay, well, here notice we've couched it in terms of political, like government, political systems. But there are other ways you could understand it, right? There's social freedom. So if you want to, should you be able to do whatever you want in public, right? There's economic freedom. There's religious. Obviously, we've talked about political. There's all kinds of things, right? So when we talk about oppression here, we've got to remember that there are different types of oppression, and often they're overlapping. Let's take, for instance, economic. Okay, so economic freedom. What is economic freedom or economic liberty? Well, we could say that, I'm just going to write it here, economic liberty. So we could say that economic liberty is what? The freedom to choose how to spend your money, right? So we could say, okay, good enough. So that we could say would be things like, we could add to this free trade, right? We could say things like free contracts, right? And we could say free spending. Okay. So we take something like free trade. We say, okay, well, what is free trade? Free trade is what? You make partnerships with other people so that you don't have tariffs and stuff like that, right? Free contracts would mean basically buyer beware. You make a contract, you're in. Free spending, spend your money on what you want, right? Okay, sounds awesome. Now, let's suppose that we were to divide our society up into those who have money and those who don't. So let's say we have the rich and the poor. What would economic liberty look like to someone who is rich? Well, they would want to be able to invest their money. They would want to be able to make free contracts. They would want things like free spending, perhaps. Who wouldn't, right? But let's take something like payday loans. So what are payday loans? Well, payday loans are what are called predatory lending. And under predatory lending, what happens is that those who have no money, the poor, can borrow money at ridiculous insurance or interest rates in order to get by in the short term. Now, here's the deal. Let's talk about something like free contracts. So should you be able to, if you are the working poor and cannot get by, should you be able to make use of predatory lending in order to, have diapers and medicine for your children? If you're rich, the idea is under economic liberty, right? So freedom of contracts, I should, yes, be able to engage in contracts that I choose, right? So you'd say, in other words, if I own the payday loan place, and I say, because of my economic freedom, I should be able to contract out with these people, and they're making free choices. They look at the agreement and they sign it, right? And if the contract is, a little skewed or whatever, they signed it, so it's up to them, right? So you would say, yes, of course. But then on the other hand, if you're here, right, and you say, okay, there's nothing I can do. I'm working. I can't afford to pay the rent next week. I don't have a bank account. I have crappy credit. What am I going to do? The only guy who will lend me money is the payday loan guy, right? So I go and I make a contract. The question is it free? In other words, do I engage in a contract with the free and equal status as the guy who owns the payday loan shop? And the answer, of course, is no, because this guy does not have freedom. This guy is investing, right? So he's investing in taking advantage of this guy's situation and limited freedom. This guy here does not have the freedom really to make choices. It's sort of like this. If you want to be on Facebook, right, and they ask you the terms and conditions, if you want to be on Facebook, you have to take the terms and conditions, and it doesn't matter what they are, right? When you sign up for your credit card, you have to sign up for the terms and conditions. If you say you don't, then you don't get the credit card. So the guy who's going to the payday loan, who's just trying to make ends meet, and you could say, well, you know, it's his own poor planning or her own poor planning or something. But the bottom line is economic liberty looks completely different from this perspective and this perspective. This guy doesn't seem to have much liberty, although he can make a choice, right? He can choose the payday loan or not. But this guy is under the gun in such a way that this guy can't even understand. This guy's freedom is about expanding his economic basis. So then how do you solve a problem like this? Because granted, predatory lending is not a good thing, right? Have you ever noticed that if you're behind on a credit card payment, they jack up your interest rate, right? So what do? Well, here's one thing where now we got to talk about liberty. Because who is going to make sure that this guy down here has some liberty? Who's going to make sure that these guys don't take complete advantage? Because what we do not want, at least in a republic, is a nation of rich and peasants. In fact, that's one of the reasons that we fought a revolution, because you had the noble class and the peasants in England. So what do? Well, here's the irony. You come in with government regulations, right? And you say, well, we are going to make laws that protect this guy from this guy, because the rich guy will always have the ability and the money and the time to figure out ways to get more of this guy's money, because this guy is too busy working several jobs. So therefore, here is an irony. With government regulations, you can ensure that there is liberty for the whole of society. So by limiting freedom, you create freedom. It's the same thing as antitrust laws, going back to free trade. If we want to have free trade and competition, you have to be able to break up monopolies. Because as soon as there's monopoly, then there's no more economic liberty, because the citizens don't have choice. So how do you make sure that there's freedom? Ironically, government regulations. If somebody, here's a stream, if I'm down here in this river and somebody's up here in this river and they are pouring toxins into the river and it comes down to me and I'm drinking, that's a glass of water, I'm drinking toxic water. Well, does he have the freedom to do that? Should I have the freedom to not be oppressed by someone's polluting my drinking water? Should I? These are the issues. When we talk about liberty, what are we talking about? Whose liberty? Liberty from what? Liberty for the whole? And do we come in with regulations and laws to ensure the liberty of the whole? It gets very complex, and we'll be dealing with nuances of this as we move forward.